Hi, I'm Carl Herzog, public historian for the USS Constitution Museum. Thanks for joining us today. Today, I am very pleased to be joined by two distinguished scholars in the field of slavery in the early American Republic. Justene Hill Edwards is an associate professor at the Corcoran Department of History at the University of Virginia. She is the author of Unfree Markets, the Slave's Economy, and the Rise of Capitalism in South Carolina. And I'm joined by Ryan Quintana, Associate Professor of History at Wellesley College. And he is the author of Making a Slave State, Political Development in Early South Carolina. Justine, Ryan, it's a pleasure to have you with us here today. I really appreciate you joining us. I wanted to ask you to come today so that we could talk about a project that the Constitution Museum is currently pursuing, looking into the entwined history and connections between slavery, particularly in coastal Georgia, and the harvesting of live oak timber for USS Constitution. So, guys, thank you so much for joining me here today.
Thank you for the invite.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. We are looking into this at the museum because we know that we've known for a long time that when the Navy in its fledgling years in the 1790s began deciding to build the six frigates that form sort of the beginning of the Navy, they decided to use live oak, a much denser, heavier timber that grew only on the coastal islands of the South, and coastal ends of the South from Carolina down Georgia. It did grow across Florida and into the Gulf, but at the time, in mid 1790, 1794, the real accessible places would have been South Carolina and Georgia, and the Navy felt that Georgia was a better fit in terms of the quality of the timber they could get. So they sent workers down there to begin harvesting timber from St. Simon's Island. And when John Morgan, a shipwright for the Navy, arrived down there, he struggled because there was little in terms of labor, and some of the New England timbermen who had gone down there either died of malaria or fled the job site. And so the Navy eventually, by the fall of 1794, turned to the existing property owners there to essentially hire out their own enslaved labor to assist with this project. And harvesting live oak timber was kind of a complicated affair, and the Navy felt that the enslaved people in the South were not going to be capable of doing the detailed work that a shipwright needed to do to get it done. But they were eager and happy to have that additional labor force clearing land, moving this timber across the 2 Mile Island to the only deep water dock where it could be shipped out of. So we've known a little bit about that, but we've been trying to explore more about it, in part because this was a real transition time for St. Simon's. It had undergone English and Spanish occupation earlier, but then had kind of largely been sort of left alone. And by the 1790s, a new group of owners eager to take the land on the island and begin planting Sea Island cotton, a Caribbean strain of cotton that was becoming very popular, took over. And so when the Navy arrived, there were several different property owners there who they contracted with. And those contracts may have initially included labor to move the timber and clear other portions of land and assist with the shipwrights. Or some of them may have been hired out independently. We have records that the primary shipwright, John Morgan, essentially from Richard Leake, one of the other property owners, had at least 5 enslaved people, including 2 women who I presume were household servants working for him individually at the time, in addition to the ones who were officially working for the U.S. government. It's kind of interesting to us because I think the general public is always surprised at the museum to discover that this was a possibility, that enslaved people would have been used by the federal government to build these ships, particularly a connection to such an iconic ship that's sort of defined as a ship of freedom as USS Constitution is, that this was a situation. And also because the lives of the people on this island, I think, in many ways defy the popular stereotypes of slavery and enslavement at the time. And these are some of the issues and context I was hoping to talk with you about today. Um, so I'd like to start off with the lives of the people on the island itself, and looking at what they had to do and how much authority enslaved people had on their own. When Barry, the Navy Commodore, heads down there, he's informed that by the property owner, one of the property house owners whose house he's going to be staying at, that there's really no one there, only an overseer. And he says that Butler says the only thing he's really using that land for is lodging for the enslaved people that he owns there at that point, not even any work going on. Uh, they would have been moving back and forth from that island and around the island by water as well too. And within a couple of years, there and throughout the island, cotton takes over and does so in sort of a task system. Um, Justine, from an economic standpoint and from a cultural standpoint, I was wondering if you could tell us if any of this kind of story rings true with what you found in your work, and what does that tell us about how enslaved people might have been living in sort of these more remote locations at the time?
Sure. Well, I think that one of the first thoughts that comes to mind is not necessarily surprise that enslaved men and perhaps even a few enslaved women were instrumental in helping to harvest the timber used for the USS Constitution. I mean, we are talking about the 1790s. We are talking about the South Carolina and the Georgia Low Country, which was absolutely dominated by enslaved labor, especially in the period after the American Revolution. Ryan knows this far better than I do, but the state governments or these newly created state governments were absolutely reliant on enslaved labor to help kind of rebuild and restore these environments after the kind of violence and tumultuousness of the American Revolution. And so, an extension of that would have been for enslaved men in particular who possessed certain types of skills, who were perhaps adept at skilled labor or even kind of rice cultivation. They would have been used. They would have been hired out to help the federal government, of course, and the Navy harvest this really important product, which was timber. And so it's absolutely not surprising because in many ways, enslaved labor was at the kind of absolute foundation of how these colonies and then states started to reconstruct themselves after the tumultuousness of the revolution.
Hmm. You mentioned, particularly after the revolution, which is I find kind of interesting. Ryan, Justine mentioned you've done a lot of work looking at the role of enslaved people in sort of building this state. It's a kind of fascinating thing. I think is one of the reason our visitors are always surprised by that, is that connection between government and slavery and enslavement, particularly in this early time period. Does this sort of echo with what you found in your work?
Yes, absolutely. I think that, I- as Justine says, it's not at all surprising to hear this, except that it's whispers in the archive, right? So often it's uh, you know you'll find it in a newspaper when someone's demanding or asking for labor, or you might find it as a side note if you're looking at a contractor's sort of account books or something like that. So it's not front and center. So in some ways, it's not surprising that people aren't aware. Also, of course, the labor of African Americans in general, not just enslaved people, has been underreported widely throughout the nation's history. So in terms of it not being surprising, I think that's that's par for the course in a lot of ways. But yeah, I mean, for my research, one of the things that was really fascinating was just finding how deep this was. This was the norm in South Carolina and Georgia and Virginia, and I think you could arguably make the same case for much of the Caribbean watershed, right? Where places, particularly along the coast, where the bulk of uh, uh, the population is enslaved, um, the labor of producing the state or constructing the state, and that varies wildly from uh, road building and canal construction, which is something I look at closely, but also building the Capitol buildings, building fortifications, pretty much building everything, right? I mean, and we're talking about in the coastal area of South Carolina, and this is also true of parts of the coastal area of Georgia. The population differential is something like 11 enslaved people to one white person, right? And the numbers skyrocket depending upon the particular place you might find yourself at, where it'll be 900 to one all of a sudden, right? And so, I think the reliance on that type of labor is the norm in that period of time. I would also say, thinking about the time period you're talking about, that this is a very significant moment of flux for South Carolina and for Georgia, not just because individuals are rebuilding and property owners are shifting and people are sort of redeveloping, particular plantation spaces, but there's also environmental disruption. So there was the Yazoo flood in the 1790s that completely wiped out rice cultivation along the coast in South Carolina and parts of Georgia, flooding all the major rivers. And in the wake of those kinds of moments, owners were more apt to want to hire out enslaved people to do contract labor of the sort that you're talking about.
Do you mean simply because if you didn't have something for these people to do for you, you were better off earning money from essentially renting people out?
Yeah, I mean, and I think Justine can speak to this way better than I can, right? But I mean, to one thing a couple of things I always say to my students, first is the Ira Berlin line, which is that slaves worked, right? So at the end of the day, um, if there's labor to do, that is where you're going to see um, the everyday lives of people. But yeah, I mean, I think maximizing the profit potential um, is the plantation owner's sole, I mean, in some ways, sole purpose, right? And I think that there's a lot that we can look at about society and culture, and those are really important things, but they're trying to make as much money as they possibly can to get as much return on investment as they can, right? And so, I think there might be some element of duty associated with it, but that's probably a more complicated, like what is duty when you're getting paid for it, I guess, is a complicated question.
And two, I mean, if I can just intervene, the tradition of enslavers hiring out their enslaved labor is pretty well documented. As Ryan just mentioned, it was a clear-cut and very profitable way of enslavers to continue to reap financial benefits from their investments in slavery and slave labor. And so, if there was a particular period of time when perhaps um, the work on a particular rice plantation was not required, an enslaver, especially if the enslaver owned an enslaved man or woman with a particular set of skills, a mechanical skill. For example, blacksmith, enslaved blacksmiths were highly valued both by enslavers and by slave traders, especially in the early 19th century. And so it was not uncommon for enslaved men in particular, but enslaved women as well, to be hired out for their skilled labor. I think perhaps the surprising part of the story, the part of the story that I find particularly interesting, is that we're talking about a period of time in which ideas of freedom, ideas of liberty are very strong, right? That rhetoric is not just resonant in the newly created United States, but in the Atlantic world more broadly. And so we are talking about the federal government really engaging with enslavers to hire out their enslaved labor at the same time that they are creating this ship, right, that is supposed to, in some ways, represent this idea of freedom and liberty. And so, I think one of the more interesting parts of this story is that as ideas of freedom start to become stronger, especially within the rhetoric of what the new nation means and what it was supposed to represent, the federal government is not just condoning but relying on enslaved labor to build um, this representation of what freedom and liberty was supposed to mean. And so that I find very, very fascinating. At the same time, we have this expansive language of freedom. We have the federal government in some way relying very clearly and directly on the labor of the enslaved. And I think that this kind of hiring out part of the conversation continues to be important because it means that in some ways the federal government is again directly supporting um, slavery in ways that we see become more contentious throughout the 19th century.
Hmm. One of the things I think that, the paradox or irony that you're hitting on is one of the things I think is what makes it such a surprise to so many of our visitors at the museum, who are shocked at exactly that sort of, dichotomy, of these two concepts bumping heads. Um, Ryan, you mentioned the disparities in the percentages of populations, and that seems to have been the case on St. Simon's as well too, where within there were a relatively small number of population on the entire island initially, but when the Navy arrives in 1794 and 1795, it's pretty small. But two large property owners arrive at the same time, purchasing large swaths of land, and immediately those numbers start to boom up. By some estimates, um, on the entire island, which is a few miles long, but miles wide, there were approximately 400 people, about half of whom were enslaved by 1796, just within a year of that. But then, as well as earlier on, the high numbers of enslaved people working on these islands relative to enslavers who oversaw them, either directly as overseers or the plantation owners, it seems to have lent itself to the creation of kind of unique cultures among the enslaved on the coastal islands. We know of the Gullah Geechee people who were still in existence on the neighboring island. I'm wondering if either you can talk a little bit, or Justine, I know within sort of the nature of the slaves' economy, their own internal economies, how are these people surviving and thriving, and what were they creating among themselves in the process?
Ryan, you take it away, and then I'll I'll follow up.
I mean, the coastal area of the South Atlantic portion of North America, right? So it's the South Carolina, the Florida coast, Georgia coast, right? I think it's to me it's always been one of the more intriguing parts of um, the North American history, because it most resembles to me, or at least the way that I imagine it, a sort of Caribbean space, right? Where it's a very much a labor camps that are isolated, and the owners are pretty well in motion, which gives a lot of space to enslaved people to I think develop communal practices in ways that they might not be able to on a plantation in the 1840s in Mississippi. Right, the labor demands are still excessive. The violence is still repressive. Right, I think that you wouldn't want to understate the lived reality of people on these spaces just because they are have a greater degree of um, autonomy. But I think the longevity of plantation agriculture in these coastal areas means that there had been a long-standing presence of African and African American peoples generationally. 1796, there had been a significant influx of newly imported people directly from West Africa. So you would have had a resurgence, perhaps, of cultural practices that emerged there. So, which is, I think partially why the Gullah and Geechee culture is so rich and so captivating to so many people. Um, right. So, yeah, I mean, I think in the historical record in the archives, you see often, a single overseer who maybe is there sometimes and is maybe gone sometimes. You see the, organizationally, through religious practices, through gender norms, through household practices, a different kind of community that is created in these spaces because of its size, because of its relative isolation, and because of the demands of labor as well.
Sure. I mean, I think that this question of kind of the retention of certain West African cultural practices and traditions is a really important part of understanding Gullah and Geechee culture, especially again because these communities were relatively isolated. But as Ryan just mentioned, because they were isolated, it didn't mean that they didn't kind of experience levels of violence that we should, I think, all be uncomfortable with, right? The fact that slavery and forms of enslavement there continued to be violent, continued to be exploitative, was kind of a counterbalance in some ways to kind of the strength of the cultural traditions that existed there. The tradition that I in particular look at in my own work is the slaves economy, and so the ways in which enslaved men, but in particular enslaved women, could maintain certain cultural traditions through their engagement in trade, through economic exchange. And I think that the tradition of economic exchange is a really interesting way of thinking about cultural retention, because in certain parts of Atlantic Africa, Black women were by and large responsible for their family's financial stability. They were the ones entrusted, and they controlled the amount of kind of goods that were coming in and flowing out of their households. They were the ones responsible for marketing their families or their communities' goods. And this tradition in particular was seen in coastal regions of South Carolina and Georgia during the period of slavery. And so those are the traditions that I find particularly fascinating. Um, but again, I mean, I like to connect it though to what we were just talking about in terms of slave hiring. There were instances in which enslaved men and women could attempt to negotiate the terms of their contract so that they themselves could try to earn money, earn purchasing power for themselves. I'm not sure if you found any evidence of this, but it was not uncommon for the enslaved to try to negotiate on their own behalf when they were hired out. And that is a part of this story that hopefully you'll find some sources to support, because I think it would be a really interesting analysis if you could find evidence of a skilled enslaved worker being able to earn money for themselves through their contractual work with the federal government.
Yeah, we are still looking into that, and initially, we're looking at a relatively small number of enslaved people altogether in a very early time period. And again, this is sort of summer and fall of 1794, and then going into 1795. And so it remains unclear, though, from the contracting toward the government, which was also a product of sort of the remote nature of the place. The Commissioner of Revenue in D.C. Had directed a customs commissioner in Savannah and another business to sort of be the contracting agents for the federal government. And they reported back to the revenue commissioner that there was a flat fee per board foot that they were going to collect, and the cutting of the timber would be the responsibility of the United States, but the transport of that timber was to the deep water dock at the other end of the island was in the hands of the contractors. However, oxen, carts, all the other implements that would have been necessary to do that were being shipped down by the government. And so that very initial beginning one is sort of the establishment of a physical infrastructure for this work to take place. But the work continues into 1795. And even later on in 95, by which point we think most of the timber for these primary ships have been built, the initial shipwright, John Morgan, who'd been sent down there, appears to have attempted to purchase for himself the entire plantation belonging to one of those property owners. And it's unclear whether he was attempting to act on behalf of the federal government, but more likely was trying to buy it up for himself at that point. And so that it's a separate issue of who was getting paid for this labor, and was it these property contractors, or to what degree, if any, were enslaved people on that island able to to negotiate something for themselves. Richard Leake, who provided some of this labor and a lot of the land and trees, reported at the tail end, almost a year later, from Sapelo Island, where he had a major plantation. He noted one day in his plantation log that his enslaved people had finally returned from St. Simon's. Now, whether this was all for the federal government or whether he was also hiring out, because as you say, Justine, he had a long history, both before and after, of hiring out enslaved people to other, nearby property owners and work. So it's unclear, but clearly there was a long-term hiring out of people, and to what degree, I'm fascinated to what degree within that extended time period of existing, semi-autonomously, at least, certainly under the yoke of another owner. But what were they able to negotiate, and how did they create, what kind of culture did they create initially, or society were they initially able to create on that island, or was it really just a sort of brutal subsistence? So we're hoping some of those still come up. What have you found in terms of bridging that gap from these sort of initial establishment time periods to a more kind of functional society of enslaved people? Is there anything? Is there any other examples of sort of that transition that we're seeing on St. Simon's?
I mean, Justine, I'm sure you can speak more to this, but while you're going through your Rolodex of knowledge, in the exact same time period in South Carolina, South Carolina undertakes this massive canal project, which I write about in my book, the Santee Cooper Canal, right? And you see the same sort of thing: dozens, hundreds of people being hired out by the state to do this very specific work. The owners got a few things out of it, right? They got money. They also imagined that they were acquiring, I think, as an aside, I guess maybe they're thinking they're acquiring important contacts with potential government officials or so forth and so on, right? But they also imagine that the people that they send to do this labor, right, are acquiring new skills and knowledge, that they can then bring back to their home plantation. So I think there's the very sort of on the ground labor that folks are being hired out to do, right? So in the case of the timber, like cutting down a live oak tree and then making it capable to be transported either by water or by land is a very complicated process that, having tried to cut down a tree in my backyard, I would never say was unskilled in any way whatsoever, right? And so I think it's very skilled labor. The kind of thing that I'm always curious about is how are people surviving in that, right? So is someone feeding them? Does someone take care of the daily camp that they find themselves at? how long are they sort of um, together doing this project? Do they go home to a particular place every night, or do they stay on site? If they stay on site, do they have people who are helping them? To me, and again, it would require like really diving into the sources, and even then there would be, sort of glaring silences. But to me, that's where you would see some of the other peripheral kinds of money making opportunities for people, right? So someone, there's lots of information about, um, peddlers arriving to work camps, selling people, everyday consumptive goods. And so, a site like this where there's a large number of workers, um, out of town contractors, uh, it would be hard for me to imagine that you wouldn't find an economy of service that, agglomerates to that particular site and any other kind of site where that kind of labor is happening.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think it would be fascinating to get to kind of create a scene of what it may have looked like or felt like for the enslaved from sunup to sundown, right? Imagine it being very kind of swampy conditions, perhaps, very physically exhausting and uncomfortable. Who was feeding the enslaved laborers? Who's clothing them? Um, yeah, I mean, all of these questions are actually really, really fascinating. And one of the first things that popped into to my head too, Carl, when you asked the question was, recall, and I think I talk about this in the book, how there were instances when enslavers were actually trying to sue the state governments for their slaves being hurt or being injured. And so I'm wondering about the tension of those relationships as well, considering how physically demanding this type of work was. I wonder the extent to which enslavers actually saw this as being a full benefit, or if if their enslaved laborers were actually kind of doing so much of this physical labor. What happened when they returned after the contract was finished? Yeah, I mean those questions I think are fascinating. Like if enslaved person came back and hurt and came back hurt, what recourse would the enslaver have had? Would the enslaver have sued the Navy? I don't know. I mean that I think is a fascinating question.
Uh, Ryan, have you found any examples of that with their work in the state and the canal project?
Sure. I mean, that is probably one of the most important pieces of information that I have is petitions from the owners of enslaved people, um, sort of demanding from the state government compensation for individuals lost. And I've always, to me, it's one of the really more fascinating things because what I want to try and figure out, and I think this goes back to something Justine was talking about earlier in the conversation about the the contradiction of this idea of freedom being made manifest through the labor of the enslaved, or the unfree, right? I think that in early South Carolina, and you see it in lots of other places as well, these petitions for compensation, they use what almost amounts to boilerplate language where they're likening the their sacrifice, which is really not their sacrifice, right? I mean, they're talking about the death of another human being, uh, equals the public good, right? And so they are, in the same way that eminent domain through the Fifth Amendment is understood today, right? They're crafting this idea of that the loss of life, the death of an enslaved African American, is oriented toward the production of the public good, right? So they see this labor as a necessity. They see it as a duty in some ways, but they themselves are not doing it. Their duty is occurring through them hiring, not even volunteering, but hiring uh, the people who they claim to own. to government officials. So you see it over and over and over again, and you see people building a road and a tree falling on top of them, right? I mean, and it's said very casually in this document, but what a shocking thing for the people who were left behind, that their loved one went and did this labor, which was probably presumed to be banal by the owner, and the loss of life occurs, right? And you know, when they're building, for example, the state capitol in Columbia, South Carolina, there's this petition where this guy says explicitly, like, I never imagined that hiring, you know, this person that he claimed to own would end up with this death. But since it did, and it was for the public good, you should pay me money, right? And that is, a very it was a very shocking thing for me to encounter, but once I really got into the materials, like it's very normative. It happens all the time, right? And it happens continually through the Civil War, right? This reliance upon this kind of labor for the creation of almost everything in the South, almost everything. And the fact that what you've discovered is that it's not just everything in the South, but it's this iconic engine of U.S. state building and warcraft and statecraft that is anchored off the coast of the city that's presumed to stand for freedom in the middle of the 19th century is even more, I think, important to tell, right? That it's not just to Maryland, it's beyond.
One of the things we're exploring as an extension of this too is our initial work has been looking at the very initial establishment of Live Oak for this, for the initial creation of this particular ship and the other 5 frigates that founded the U.S. Navy in the 1790s. But we also know that Live Oak continued to play a role in shipbuilding, particularly naval shipbuilding, for decades after that, and so much so to the degree that that the federal government did acquire and set aside large swaths of property for to keep oak for themselves and prevent it from just all being kind of clear cut for other functions. And so I do think that there's a broader extension, like you say, Ryan, of this, continuing on. And I just, given the nature and depth of it, I'm hard pressed to imagine that there wasn't continued involvement both in Blackbeard's Island to the north, which the Navy acquires, but also some other ones a little bit later on in the Gulf Coast region, where this kind of harvesting is continuing. But as that establishes itself, you both raised and just fascinated by this idea of establishing skill sets too, that become valuable, because certainly, as you vividly suggest, right, cutting these trees is not an unskilled labor by any stretch of the imagination, and live oaks are even harder. But even if their initial involvement is just in hauling cut timbers, the I don't want to call it opportunity, but the reality of enslaved people then developing a greater skill set that gets leveraged in other places on behalf of the government, I think becomes a broader kind of thing that we're still just scratching the surface of.
Yeah, I mean, one of the topics that I think is just truly fascinating is the idea that I think it is perhaps simpler for us to believe that the enslaved were merely agricultural workers. But if you look at the historical record, if you look at the or read the words and memories of the formerly enslaved, you get a sense that their lives were structured by labor in, I think, really important ways, and they developed these skills that I think we would recognize as being highly valuable. And in many ways, too, enslavers and slave traders were thinking of the skills that enslaved men and women cultivated in that exact same way. If you read slave advertisements, enslavers and slave traders were not hesitant to kind of play up the skilled work that enslaved men and women had developed, whether they were blacksmiths or shoemakers, whether they were seamstresses or cooks, most certainly wet nurses, if they were. There were just kind of a constellation of skills that enslaved men and women were developing, and they were highly, highly valuable. And so, I agree with Ryan. The felling of trees, the clearing of land was highly skilled labor, and enslavers surely were seeing the contributions that enslaved men in particular could make, in terms of their increased value in the marketplace if they ever needed to be or were being sold. And so again, if you look at the advertisements of enslaved laborers, it was not uncommon for these skills to be played up to increase their prices in the marketplace.
Whether hiring out or selling out, right?
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
And I would add to that, Carl, just if I can really quickly. I mean, one of the things that I mean, we're talking about 1794, 1795, right? So, it's just a decade after the Revolution ends in the South, and enslaved people were building fortifications. So they're not just transporting lumber; they're designing the lumber for those fortifications. They're and you see, for example, there's a maroon community, so a community of runaways on the Savannah River, and when Georgia and South Carolina officials find that community after years of it remaining hidden, right, what they encounter is a fortified space, one that the militia writes back and says, "This is really surprising that it's so well fortified." But it's not that surprising given the fact that both the British Army and the U.S. Army had been using that labor to create fortifications in the first place. The same thing is true. South Carolina is the rare state that has its own navy, although that seems kind of likely for South Carolina in some ways. And they rely upon enslaved labor at the naval yard, right? And the kinds of work they're doing is elusive in the at least the documents that I saw, right? But you can imagine they're doing everything, from rope braiding, to building the ships themselves, to warping the wood, right? And particularly at a time of war. So, and not just war, but I mean, I think it's really important to note Georgia, the coastal part of South Carolina and Georgia, that is an acutely, I mean, like there's a very, it's a focal part of the war, right? And so that kind of labor is incredibly valuable and really important throughout the war's duration. And it's just a decade before the period we're talking about,
Yeah.
less than a decade.
I think we've certainly seen that too in other history connected to the role of enslaved people in maritime communities. Among the skill sets that we haven't talked about is the capabilities of enslaved people to operate vessels, to become sailors and captains and pilots. And I've certainly seen evidence around St. Simons and the Georgia Islands of enslaved people who were being hired out as pilots to help other vessels through sort of the maze of rivers and creeks that run through the expanses of salt marsh that surround both these islands. And for all of these people, transport up and down from Savannah and certainly Charleston, but Savannah and Darien, another community to the north, and Sapelo Island, along the coastline and down to St. Simons in any kind of large quantity, seems to have been a waterborne enterprise. There were, by 1790s, it appears still a very limited kind of road network, and certainly nothing that you were going to be hauling heavy timber along. or extensive wagons and stuff. So this was all about transport by water. And when Leake in January of 1796 reports that enslaved people had returned, the men that he had sent down to St. Simon's had returned. He immediately puts them to clearing land there again. And while it's not implied, while it's not specified in his journal, certainly the implication was they sailed back on their own. And a lot of them were doing that. Justine, when you mentioned, how'd they live? What'd this look like? Who was surviving? This transport was ongoing. And in and of itself required a pretty incredible skill set. Navigating those waterways was difficult and fraught with hazards from, whether it was flooding or just tides or easily getting lost among that salt marsh. There is a whole nother kind of skill set there, I think, too, as well, that gets left behind. Yeah. I wanted to, before we close out here, sort of touch base on where the work that you guys have done in this field you think is heading in terms of redefining what the broader public sees of this history. Again, we at the museum encounter people from all over the world on a daily basis who are shocked and surprised at the relationship with this history. But do you feel that this is, where are we headed in terms of better understanding the role of enslaved people and sort of the creation, not just of things for the government, but in the establishment? Ryan, you've called it the establishment of spaces and space itself. Are we getting a better understanding of these contributions at this point? I take from either of you what your thoughts are at this, Justine.
Sure. Well, if anything, I hope that your visitors, especially in terms of the history of slavery and the relationship between the labor of enslaved people and the creation of this ship, just get a broader understanding of the crucial role of the enslaved in the construction of this nation. As Ryan has said, they were really important. They were foundational in the construction of so many aspects of the nation in its first decades, and African Americans continue to be. And so, thinking about the really important role of the enslaved, specifically, but the institution of slavery writ large in the everyday lives of Americans in the early national period, I think is really important, because I think often the narrative gets replayed in terms of ideas of freedom, ideas of celebrating the creation of this new nation in terms of liberty and rights. But it was on the backs, using the labor of the enslaved, that Americans could even speak in those terms, could even talk in those terms, could even talk about political and economic rights. And so to ignore the contributions and the experiences of the enslaved, I think, is to not recognize an important part of this story. And that is the visible contributions of the enslaved in the building of a nation.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's what just, I would echo everything Justine said. And, I think that um, just hearing about this particular project that you're working on, Carl, that y'all are working on and that the museum's working on, one of the things that I'm just drawn to about it is just to try to imagine, well, first, like, how does the popular public consider the relationship between the federal government and local places at the start of the nation? I think the bulk of people would assume it's pretty minor at best, if you know if it exists at all. And one of the things that you're showing is no, in fact, federal government is clear cutting an entire island to acquire timber for its navy, and it's inserting itself squarely in one of the most important coastal islands in Georgia or in the South Atlantic and North America. So to me, I think that's a really important part. And as Justine says, and as you're showing with the work that you're doing, it's not just that they're down there doing something, but that they're doing it via enslaved labor, right? Via the unfree work of hundreds and thousands of people, right? And that makes for a really complicated story, and there's no easy way to confront that, right? But I think what's equally important, right, is what happens after, right? So the coastal islands become the site of the production of sea island, but beyond that even, and during the labor to acquire the timber, right, the communities of people who reside there, who move there, that they have lives, right, that they have loved ones, they eat, they sleep, they have everyday lives there. And archaeologists and anthropologists have shown us what some of that looks like in St. Simons and on some of the other coastal islands, and it's a really complicated place, right? That is, I think is created out of the labor that the federal government demands, and then plantation owners demand, but out of the dreams and aspirations of the people who live there, and it creates this really interesting place that I think is to me, if there's any hope of trying to like reconcile that terrible past with the nation, I think it's to think about the lives that people build for themselves, even in the midst of the terror of slavery and the brutality of slavery, right? That not just lives, but cultures that still are thriving to this day, and that's really important, I think.
Yeah. Thank you. Any other closing thoughts from either of you on this? I really appreciate you taking time to join me today.
Thank you, and I'm looking forward to seeing the new research. No, I'm just looking forward to seeing the research that you uncover with the history of the enslaved labor in this ship.
Yeah, we're still working. Ryan?
I mean, I think this is a great project. I'm going to probably bug both of you to hear more about how it's going and the stuff that you find. And, you know, I think it's a really important thing that you're doing, and I'm excited to see where it goes. And, having worked at the Smithsonian, at the Museum of American History for a little bit, and having done public programming, uh, it's the best way to engage and interact with like the most people, and to let the most people know this story. So, to me, you're doing God's work, and like this is great. I'm really happy to have been just a tiny part of it.
Well, we certainly hope to continue to be able to do that. And again, I thank you both for joining me today and taking time out of your own busy schedules to talk about this. And stay tuned. Hopefully, we'll have an opportunity to get back together again as we continue to find some more of those details and paint some better detailed sort of pictures of this process and what it contributed and how it contributed not only to the life and culture and evolvement of the island itself and St. Simons and that coastal region, wherever Live Oak was, but also the even certainly far longer and broader stretched implications of ships like USS Constitution continuing to sail around the world, made from the timber that was harvested with the labor of the enslaved people on those islands. So again, I thank you both very much for joining me today. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carl.
Have a good one, guys.